like a late 15th century warfare. In fact, we had to move people around a bit. So Adam Chapman is actually going to talk to us about Agincourt, about Davy Gams. So it didn't quite fit with this. But otherwise, the other two papers are very much of the same period. When my PhD students Kate Bicknell on the Stanleys, particularly the poems. And we're going to kick off, though, with connecting very nicely with the final comment I made last night about the future is archaeology. Because Peter Masters has been working on quite a lot of battlefields. He tells me particularly Stoke, the battle of the early part of the reign of Henry VII, but also at Bosworth, into geophysics for the Bosworth book that went forward and I edited, and also Agincourt, which is quite important because of HS2, I think, isn't it?
Correct.
So there's quite a lot of interest in it there. So it is great to have somebody working from a different perspective, not historical but geophysical perspective. So many thanks, Peter, for coming. Look forward to hearing what's on.
Thank you.
I thought I'd just start off from the continuation from yesterday. I posted a few pictures up yesterday on Facebook regarding our trips to Mary Rose and Fort Nelson and etc. And one of my friends decided to reply to this. So, this is what he quoted. Fort Nelson would have been our first line of defence if we had lost Agincourt. So, without more ado, I will now move on quite a few decades from Agincourt to the other battle, the Civil War that raged in in England between the two houses of the Yorkists and the Lancastrians. So, what I'm going to do is just take you through what I've been working on, which is the decisive battle of 1487, which is the as bloody as it was with Towton in the earlier decades, in 1461. So I'm going to go through and tell you where the location of the battlefield is, as we see it today, give you some historical background, so I'm going to do a bit of history, but I'm an archaeologist, so remember that. And then I'm going to talk about the geographical surveys that I've carried out, but not only myself, but one of my students, and I'm then going to talk about the borehole investigations that I've carried out to actually relocate the one of the mass graves. And the osteological analysis, again, one of my students carried out the work on the remains that were recovered back in 1982. And I will then talk about the future work and then conclude with the overview of what I've spoken about. So oh, come on, what's it doing? Go away. Right, before I talk about this, first of all, Bosworth, which took place 2 years earlier in 1485, was basically merely the death of a king. There were very few deaths that took place there. There were very few casualties, not as many as at Towton and later in 1487 with the Battle of Stoke. So, East Stoke lies approximately 4 miles to the southwest of Newark-on-Trent and approximately about 13-14 miles from Nottingham, which lies to the southwest of East Stoke. East Stoke lies on the old road of... it's gone out of my head. The Fosse Way, thank you. Lies along the Fosse Way. And today is bypassed by the new A46. So it's, again, a quiet village. So, as I said, the Battle of Stoke Field was one of the bloodiest battles ever to be fought on English soil, apart from Towton, as we know, because we do have the human remains from there. It was also known as the Furner Conflict in what is known as the Wars of the Roses today. At the time, it was not known as the Wars of the Roses. We don't know what it was called. We have very little information. And this of course, was a political struggle between the two houses, the Yorkists, over 30 years. And this particular battle was the final, basically, the final battle of the Wars of the Roses. Although, saying that, there were a number of skirmishes that continued on until the sort of 1490s. But they were really nothing. They were just skirmishes. So, what do we know about the battle itself? Well, we have very little accounts of the battle. It's very brief. A lot of information that we know of is quite contradictory. A lot of the information that we do dwell upon is Virgil's accounts of, which are much later. They're about 25 years later than the battles. And of course, the one thing you always get is there's also a biased angle to these battles. And of course, the winning side is always going to put a little twist in the tale, and there's a lot of propaganda. And of course, we see that in much later battles and even in more modern conflicts, such as the First World War. So, moving on, how was the battle fought? Well, we know that in May 1487 there was a Yorkist revolt being cooked up by the Viscount Lovell and the Earl of Lincoln, who then decided that they would produce a boy king known as, who was the pretender to the throne, Edward VI, and he was crowned in Dublin Cathedral. So the rebel army was comprised of Irish soldiers and German mercenaries, whom reunited. Now we come back a little bit. We've been talking about Burgundy. So they reunited in Burgundy under the captaincy of Martin Schwartz, and they landed in Lancashire on the coast there at Furness, and they made their way down south through these various towns to the river crossing at the Trent. Henry, and this is what we know of at the present time, then marched north from Kenilworth Castle. His soldiers were under the command of the Earl of Oxford, and they both met at Stoke. Now, these maps have been sort of... this is one interpretation of several of the battle formation. This one is more or less based around the book by David Baldwin. So it's the only sort of definitive publication that I know of at the present time on the battle. And the Earl of Lincoln's army basically got to Stoke before the Lancastrian army, and it is known. Well, one theory is that they forded the River Trent at Fiskerton. Well, between Fiskerton and Newark, there are a number of crossings that they could have come across. So it's not necessarily that they would have directly come across at this point. And basically, the Earl of Lincoln's army held the high ground known as Burham Furlong. Well, we're not sure exactly where Burham Furlong is. And he had basically commanding views of the whole ground. However, if you look at this ground, and I can show you some present-day pictures of the battlefield, where you see the formation here of the Yorkist in a sort of wedge formation, which they saw the steady advance of the Royal Vanguard coming along the Old Fosse Way, and the Old Fosse Way is this one here, I think. Yeah, this one, which is also known as Humber Lane today, partly, which runs up from the village. And this is the later Fosse Way, the old A46 as we see it today. So, to the back of the actual Lancastrian army, the actual ground slopes quite gradually, but not just gradually. It slopes quite steeply, and also on the River Trent side, you've got a steep escarpment. So basically, to their backs, you can see what's going to happen. They've actually cornered themselves into a situation that they will not get out of, as you'll see as the battle goes on. So I say this is at 9 o'clock on the 16th of June 1487, and we know that the Lancastrian army, the Yorkist army, was made up to about 9,000 strong, including German handguns, crossbows, foot soldiers, archers, alongside the English longbowmen and billmen. Compared to the 15,000 Lancastrian army, the Royalist army. So this is where they met, and by noon on that day, the battle was virtually over. It was a very short-lived battle, and the rebel force basically sort of tried to escape across the ford at Fiskerton, but down the Red Gutter, and I'll show you a picture of the Red Gutter. It's quite a narrow gully, but basically it was the end. It was a bloodbath for them because there was no escape. There was no way that they would have got across that ford quickly enough to be captured in this situation. However, following the battle, Lambert Simnel was apparently pardoned. So we know from the historic records, and he was put to work as a scullion in the King's kitchen, while Richard Simmons was imprisoned. However, historians have also postulated that Lord Lovell was one of the insurgents drowned attempting to cross the Trent, if you believe that. But others have suggested that he lived long after the battle, and the other suggestions that he wasn't actually even present. And he lived at Minster Lovell Hall, where later on his house was pulled down to the ground, and they did find a body in the vault and cellar. I don't know if you've seen an image of the skeleton at the table, typical image. And when they actually touched this fine-clothed person, the whole thing collapsed into a heap of powder. So that's the sort of layout of the battle. Now, if we move on to looking at the landscape features of today, we know that the church and the hall, not the present hall, but an earlier hall, was here at Stoke. And then we also have a commemorative stone. This is a modern stone of the dead that fought at the battle. And this is what the Red Gutter looks like on the left-hand side. You can see how overgrown it is, but how narrow that Red Gutter. Now, a lot of people have always thought that, the reason why it was called the Red Gutter was because there were a number of soldiers that were slain there and the blood just ran. Well, I can disprove that as straight away, because the Red Gutter was basically the final route. Basically, why it's called Red Gutter? Well, it's to do with the actual geology there. It's red Kuiper marl, clay, and if you try and put an auger into this clay, it's horrendous. It's very hard work, indeed. And then this is up on the top. Once you've walked up through the gutter and up onto the top of the battlefield, this is what it looks like from one point. Okay, it's flat ground. And just a short distance to the southwest is an airfield. Well, an airfields were always sited up on high ground, on flat ground. Hence why the battle was fought here. And then this is view from looking back from the River Trent, and you can see the high ground here, up along here, and there's the old Fossway running along the top. And then this is the view now looking back at the battlefield again. So the battlefield's over here, and there's the village of East Stoke. So this is the modern A46. And of course then we have also the Burrow and Bush stone. Originally it might not have been a stone, it could have been, I think it was a tree that was put there. Why do we have a Burrow Bush stone? Well, that's to do with the when Henry finally arrived at the end of the battle, because he actually wasn't there at the time. When he finally arrived there, he marked the spot where with his standard after his victory, and so basically the royal standard saluted his triumph that day, and the king made 13 bannerets and 52 knights at the time, according to historic records. And then on the right side, you can see another view from the bypass again, looking northwest, and you can see how the ground from the high ground down slopes quite remarkably. Yeah. So you can see now why the Yorkists were in a difficult situation. They managed to put themselves in a sort of a no-win situation. And if we look at the landscape from the air, you can see how we see this today. And you can see up to the north there is Newark, and you can see the bend of the river. Now the course of that river has changed. So the likelihood of that river doing that large loop around there may not have been as wide as that. And you can see down the left here is the escarpment, and there's the airfield here, and there's the battlefield across here, and here are the medieval fields around the village, Ridge and Furrow. And this is what we believe to be the extent of the battlefield from the Battlefields Register held by Historic England now, not English Heritage. And coming on to the historic environment records, so when I first started my research on this in 2008, I needed to look at the historic records. What records did we have of the finds from there? This area here, which is the area I'm going to talk about in particular, because this is where the area of interest lies. We had a burial pit up here. Apparently there was a couple more burial pits from antiquarian accounts down here, and one next door to the actual road itself, and a medieval coin. This area here and here are scheduled ancient monuments. So you can see the difficulties of getting permissions to do any work there. But fortunate that I work closely with Historic England and the Inspector of Ancient Monuments in this region, so I was fortunate to be able to get into there and have good relationships with the landowners as well, which is quite important. So I did an initial test in 2008 of a geophysical survey. I haven't presented them here, but this is the survey of one of my students, Charles Enright, who did several battlefields from the Wars of the Roses and the English Civil War. And this is the results of some of the work that we did there. And you can see the gradiometer results here. These anomalies that are circled in yellow are potential locations. However, saying that, geophysical surveys have failed to date to locate any mass graves on battlefields, including Towton in particular. Tim Sutherland has done extensive work. He has not had very much success either. And then we've also carried out a resistivity survey, and you can see there's some correlation. This particular location, if we go back, the survey that I'm showing you is actually this area here. So we've put it around the area that the mass grave was found. And if I move on, we also did some electromagnetic surveys and radar. And you can see radar has given us some signatures of the possibility of the actual grave. Moving on to 2012, this is the work I've carried out since, and here up in the top are the ends of the cottages, Victorian cottages. This is the edge of the open field system, and this is where you have the River Furrow, and it's extensive. But I'm going to carry out a more extensive survey in due course, and I've also carried out the survey right across the actual burial pit itself. And you can see there is some sort of indication where the furrows are coming to a head, and there's some sort of indications of a burial pit. And we also know that the actual casualties were buried outside the ends of crofts and tofts. They wouldn't put them anywhere near where your habitation is. Coming into 1982, this is the Mike Bishop carried out a rescue excavation when they actually slightly widened the road and also put in a drainage ditch. And this is the actual couple of photographs of the remains that were found at the time. Included in the finds was actually an iron bangle, which went to the University of Nottingham and has not been seen since. So I then carried out some borehole surveys around the battlefield, and this is the I'm now showing you the ones that I did in 2012 and in very recently, only about a month ago, to relocate where the actual mass grave was found. And lo and behold, I found it in the spot that was marked on the historic environment record, which is a miracle because normally that doesn't happen. But also, either side of these locations, I looked at other areas where there were actually sunken areas in the field, and basically they didn't produce any information whatsoever. So I have relocated the mass grave. So moving on to the osteological analysis, we have here the I've just got to find my notes, excuse me, because I'm not an anthropologist. So here we have a congenital defect on the left-hand side, which has been fused together. This is the calcaneus and the talus. Now, I'm going to demonstrate where this is because a lot of people don't know where the calcaneus and the talus is. It's actually your heel bone. Okay. Now, what normally these actually fuse together in later life. But because there's a defect, they haven't fully fused, and you can see that here. Okay. And basically, the likelihood is that what we have found from all of them is that they all suffered from osteoarthritis. This is not unusual because that's also been found from the Mary Rose and also at Towton. But basically, this particular defect, this trauma, is caused from squatting. So if you think about the squatting, then the strain, the trauma that you're putting on that is quite evident. And then on the left-hand side, the right-hand side, you've got this is showing a fracture in the bone. Out of the 3 skulls we have, we've seen some ante-mortem trauma, but they've healed. You can see that there has been some slices to the parietal bones, which I'll point out is here. And I think there's another slice in here. That is caused by sharp trauma, so basically a blow to the head with a sword. And also there has been some indications of pitting. I'm not sure if I can see that on there. probably all this pitting, yes, you can see it, is due to anemia. Moving on, this particular one, this is quite interesting. This is the vertebrae, part of the vertebrae on the left-hand side. This is here is the Schmall's node, which is pointed there. This is caused by heavy lifting. So you can see how related this is to the, a soldier in combat. And then on the very little has been done with CT scans, and this is a CT scan of one of the femurs, and you can see that the B is pointing out where the new bone growth is on the fracture at A. And from the results, we have found that they're all male, surprise, surprise, and the age range is between 17 and 39 years old, and they average 163 centimetres to 186 centimetres. And as I said, the pathology of all of them is that some of them basically have got osteoarthritis. Very little postcranial trauma was observed on the remains, and there are a lot of squatting facets observed on the tibia in particular. So what about the future work? Well, I've only skimmed over the surface of this so far since I've been studying it. I mean, it's getting time to actually do the research, but there needs to be a full topographical survey of the whole battlefield to understand that landscape. Also to use LiDAR. Well, there is some LiDAR, but the actual resolution is not good. The Environment Agency have now released all of theirs, and you can actually access them free of charge. But they're at 2 metre resolution, so it's not good enough. Further auger surveys, yes, I think that's essential. And further soil analysis as well, with total phosphate analysis, etc., although that can be flawed. But an extensive geophysical survey is necessary, and also excavation of that burial pit is necessary to uncover that burial pit, to fully recover as much information that we have very little information from the 1982 rescue excavation. And so basically, in conclusion, I have confirmed the location of all the mass graves, which was partially excavated. There is good correlation with the mass graves at Towton, and I say further geophysics and future research will enable a greater understanding of this conflict, including looking at the documentary sources as well in association with it. So there has to be the historical element to it as much as the archaeological, this integrated approach. And just a few acknowledgements. Thank you.